Can everybody hear me? I just want to say that everything he just said is probably about maybe 10% true. So the other 90%, it's definitely, he's right. It's definitely been quite a journey to get where we're all at today. And I thought I would just start off by saying, gwad. I'm really glad that everybody was here. All of you pretty much, are familiar with me and my work and the things that I do. And the other thing that I want to say to you is that I really appreciate all of you, because in this journey that we're all on, we're all on it together. And when I first started out back in the day, and when I say back in the day, I mean like the early 2000s. I graduated high school in 2000, and at the time, there wasn't really this whole language thing, taking place in any of the communities. It was kind of just starting out, and I think the reason for that is because in the 90s, we still had quite a bit of elders left. We still had, Huron Miller. We still had Jake Thomas. We still had, P. Sky, and quite a few of them. So I think we all kind of just took for granted that, they would always be around, and they'd be around for a while. Our parents would, take the lead for us, and they would kind of, set the scene for when it became our turn. So I didn't really have language on my mind in the 90s, and in the 2000s. I graduated high school, and I had left the area for a little while in 2001. I went down to Arizona, and I went to school there and became a Harley-Davidson mechanic. I came back and did that for a little while, and I just kind of felt something else. I needed, something, another challenge. So that's kind of when I went to sit with my great-grandmother, Esther Sundown. She was the first language speaker, and she was just reaching that point in her life where she was kind of getting old. I mean, she lived to be 96, so to her, getting old was probably like when she started turning 90. That's when she really started slowing down. So it was probably like in her early 80s. She really wanted somebody to kind of take on this role of learning language. And at the time, there were actually three of us. There was myself, there was my cousin, Rusty Jonathan, and then our older cousin, Lonnie Abrams. We all call him Yubby. So the three of us would sit in her in her living room in this small little house at Tonawanda. And 2 nights a week, we would just sit there with her and talk about language. She was very knowledgeable, and she played an important role in my life when it came to ceremonial speaking, because that's what her father was. Her father was Edward Blacksboro, and he was a Tonawanda speaker for our longhouse in the 30s, and he passed away in 1940. So he was a sub-chief for the Hawk Clan, and then her grandfather, Barbara Blacksboro, was a condole chief for the Bear Clan in Tonawanda, and he was also a longhouse speaker. So she grew up with quite a bit of exposure to ceremonies. That's really what she was always talking about, when we would sit with her. And at the time, I didn't really understand as much as I do now. And again, you kind of just take for granted that, I grew up on territory, I grew up around, ceremonies, so I understand. And I would say that, I understand, I've been there, I've seen these things. But then, as time went on, and I began to learn a little bit more language, it was almost like you stepped on one side of the curtain over to the other. And that was really profound for me, because I never really understood, what it meant, when they would talk about these things. So that's when I really became motivated to learn, to pick up what she was able to offer before her time came. So that was when I started my language journey. And my grandma could only, translate things to a certain degree. But one of the things that I had learned sitting there was that there was a reason for that. And one of the reasons for that is because the way that our ancestors spoke, even in the old days, when I say old days, I mean like going back hundreds of years, is that the reason why that they didn't develop any kind of written language even back then, because they certainly had the mental capacity to do so, was because they knew that communication between two individuals face to face was the way to go. They understood at that time that the way our language is that it's very visual. It's very prophetic. It's also very poetic, and it's also very, you have to just be mentally aware. Because we all know that you can fit a lot of information just in one word. Our ancestors incorporated nouns and verbs together, which a lot of languages don't do. We also incorporate what we call pronominal prefixes, or the pronouns. We can incorporate pre-pronominal prefixes. We can also incorporate suffixes, aspect suffixes, and then even extended suffixes. And that's quite a bit of information just in one word. And I didn't really understand that back then. So one of the other things that I had a hard time at the beginning was hearing words and understanding the breakdown of them, but not understanding the context or the use of them. And that was kind of difficult. So then I began to understand when we would hear our elders say, well, I know what it means, but I just can't translate it. And we've all heard that. We've heard that quite a few times in our life. And that's when I really started to even dig further into language, more than just sitting in the living room with my grandmother. So I started doing more history, looking into the history, because I wanted to know, because obviously I started to understand that the way our ancestors lived prior to colonization, prior to invasion of European values, language, and laws, that our ancestors lived a completely different way. And the way that they lived, none of us can ever really say, just like the language that we understand. So in 2006, I began working at the museum here, just over in the city of Rochester. And even that has been quite a journey, because that was 17 years ago. And I never thought I would ever make it that far there or here. So when I began working at the museum, one of the reasons why I went there in the first place is because those nights that I would sit with Esther in her little living room, one of the names that came up in her stories from when she was little was her grandmother. Her grandmother was Julia Black Squirrel. Julia Black Squirrel was a clan mother for the Tonawanda Seneca Nation. And she lived to be right around the same age as Esther. She lived to be about 98 years old before she passed away. So one of my favorite stories was that she said, when I was little, my grandma Julia would organize basket making circles. She would gather the older women, and they would sit around in the circle, and they would make baskets. She said they would all speak nothing but Seneca. And in the circle is where they would put all the little babies. So she said, because I was the older one, it was up to me to take care of the babies and tend to the babies in the middle of the circle. So she said that I'll always remember that. And it's true, because that was the story that always came up when she would talk about that time. So she had a lot of exposure to her grandmother also. And I just thought that that was very awesome. So at the time, this was the early 2000s. The internet was just kind of breaking ground all over the world. So I typed Julia Black Squirrel into the internet, thinking, well, maybe something will come up. And what came up was the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And at the time I thought, well, what the heck does a museum, 50 miles away have to do with anything from my great-great-great-grandmother here in Tonawanda? So I sent them an email. I didn't hear anything back. And then everything goes the way it should. Because 2 months later, I met this woman by the name of Adele DeRosa, who worked at the museum. And I met her at this college dinner, of all places. She introduced herself, and I said, hey, I sent you an email 2 months ago, and I was inquiring about my great-great-great-grandmother, Julia Black Squirrel. And she looked at me, and her eyes got really big, and she says, yes, I know all about Julia. And my eyes got even bigger, because I thought, who the heck does this non-native woman know anything about my great-great-great-grandmother? So she invited me to the museum, and I was just taken back, because seeing the baskets that Julia made in the museum with potato stamps, and they were all dyed, and they were just magnificent sitting there. It was almost as if they were waiting for me to come in and rediscover who they were. It was almost as if Julia was standing there with her arms open and waiting for me to rediscover her and meet her. And I always give credit to Adele, because she didn't just introduce me to the museum world, she introduced me to my ancestors. So that gave me even more motivation. That motivated me to rediscover not only the language, but the people behind the language. And the people behind the language is us. Our ancestors worked very hard, and they worked even harder when we were invaded by this invader that came from a foreign land. They did what they could, and they did the best with what they had. And the best with what they had was family. And that family circle is exactly how Esther described when the women would sit in the circle and they would put the babies in the center. It reminded me of the circle of chiefs when the peacemaker created what we now call the Ganödagë. He told the chiefs to stand in the circle and lock arms. And inside the circle would be the people. And they would do their best never to unlock, and they would try their hardest and be steadfast so that the people on the inside would have comfort. And that's what Esther did, and she did it for all of us at Tonawanda. And it's unfortunate that certain people at Tonawanda couldn't understand her vision. They couldn't understand her love and affection, and she received a lot of criticism, and I witnessed it with my own 2 eyes. And I'm sure today, the position that we are in at Tonawanda, I'm sure it would be a lot different. So she did her best, and she did very well. So working at the museum, I not only discovered this collection of baskets, I also discovered artifacts by the thousands that dated back to about 2,000 to 3,000 years old, 2,000 to 3,000 BC. And I was just taken back, because as a Seneca, I should have been able to identify those things, but I couldn't. I should have been able to identify certain bone tools, things that are still mentioned in the language, but I couldn't identify them. So that motivated me even more. It added another layer. So those layers that kept adding up, I just kept digging deeper and deeper until I finally figured out that the language that we think that we're studying we can only study it from a superficial point of view because we grew up pretty easily. We had it pretty easily. So as you dig deeper and deeper into the language, you not only discover that in the language, you don't just see rules, you don't just see verbs, you don't just see the linguistic aspect of it. You see the many layers of generations, the many speakers who came and went, the speakers who stood and spoke the speeches for the people, which is, burial, Hoya'danä, the condolence, all of those things. I was very fortunate to have been studying in a time when these speakers were still around. And I'm in great debt to Dowdy. I'm in great debt to Pete Sky. I'm in great debt to Richard Mitchell, Esther Sundown, and so on. They were all mentors, and they all did their best to have input and to contribute to what I was able to study and still studying today. At that time, I understood, and my grandmother always told me, she always said, you better learn now because I'm not going to be here forever. So that motivated me because I said, all right, that makes sense. So what I have to do is I have to make sure that I can study, not just list of words and memorize them, but how can I get to a point where I can be self-sufficient? A point to where I can change the language to my own needs, to where I can conjugate words without having an elder sitting in front of me, because that day is coming. And as we sit here now, today, June 20th, 2023, that day is here. There are no first language speakers left at Tonawanda. So back in the late 2000s, that's when I started thinking, I have to be able to make sure that I can do what I can do without having the elder sitting in front of me. Because the time is true, the time will come when they won't be here to ask, what does this mean and how can I change it? So I started doing even more. And in 2012, I was chosen as this small cohort to go to California and sit with Wallace Chafe, who was a non-native and studied the language from a colonized point of view. I had my reserves. I was very reluctant as to what this non-native person could teach me that an elder couldn't. But I had an open mind, and for 10 days, every day, from 9 until about 5 in the afternoon, we sat in this classroom. And at that time, when I was done, I knew that it was meant to be, because he offered those technical questions that I needed to get where I wanted to be, which was to be self-sufficient. That was to change the language to what I had to do and to be able to change it around without an elder sitting in front of me to ask. So again, it was a lot of work, and I can see definitely why the elders were very concerned. I could see their concern when I would ask questions, and I was asking the questions that they couldn't answer. It wasn't because they couldn't answer because they didn't know, it was just because they couldn't understand the technicality of which I was asking. So I really appreciate all those different steps that had to be taken. And I really appreciate the people and my peers and the people who came after me, who were willing to say, or who were saying, I'm willing to do the same. And I really appreciate you. I appreciate you as much as I appreciate the elders, because it was even more motivation. How could I be in a circle surrounded by elders tending to the children if there were no children in the circle? So to have new learners come along and say, I'm willing to do this, every step of the way, that meant a lot to me. So I'm really fortunate that I was able to spend that time. And I was very fortunate that The museum granted me the time to be able to travel to the Haudenosaunee territories, to learn from different speakers, to hear different ways on how speakers spoke, to hear their own stories about being put in the different positions that they were in. That was very profound, and I'll never forget it. To be here today amongst this fine group of people who are learning and you are doing your best, and that is all that you can do. So I just wanted to start out by saying, Yahweh, to all of you. It's no easy task, and I know for a fact that we are going to do fine. So, some of the words that I was able to, that I just want to offer you today. So it's just very, awesome to me because it all went the way it should. So there was a time when I thought, man, this is getting too much, and I just have to step back. I have to take a break because I needed something else in my life, and I had to just occupy my mind and let it cool and let the steam clear for a little while. And that was when Mr. Webster emailed me, and at the time I wasn't looking clearly at the signs, and I ignored his emails thinking that he didn't understand. So when he came, I said, Damien, I'm looking for somebody to kind of take over where I'm going to leave off for a little while. So he took that task and he said, I'm willing to do that. And I'm very appreciative to Damien Webster because he was able to pick up where I was able to take a break and step back. So family life, it's been very good to me, and it's going to be good to me for the rest of my life. Raising kids and watching a baby be born, it was just as profound as sitting with my grandma Esther and talking about that circle of babies. So being a father, it's nothing that any perfect man could ever achieve. To be a perfect father. To be a teacher to a community and to a father to a family is the same thing. It's the same amount of work, and it's a lot. So I appreciate my family as well. I appreciate them showing me that there's more to life than just sitting around and staring at pages 24/7, because that's literally what I was doing. So to be here, I really thank all of you. The work that you do, it doesn't go unnoticed, I promise you. And I promise you that you'll have a fulfilling life. I promise you that the ancestors are definitely happy, because I just want you to know everything happened the way it should. Working at the museum and seeing the things that I've seen, it's added a lot more understanding to the language. Ironically, a museum is a colonized institution, and I didn't know how to feel when I first started working there. I thought that the museum was nothing but a building full of thieves and robbers, grave robbers. They took from our people and hardly ever gave back in return. To travel to the places that I've traveled, I know that it was meant to be. The ancestors looked for someone to come and look for them. And I didn't discover that until later on. Many times we went to ceremony. Many times I attended Grand Council. Many times I went to group meetings where we talked about the future. And many times that those discussions seemed very dim, because we knew that the future was coming. And that future was a time when the elders would not be here anymore, and it would be up to us. So many times they would burn tobacco, and they would ask our ancestors for help. They would ask our ancestors to please with all the most power that they have in that other world to help us. So many times I stood there listening to the speaker plead to the Creator, to his messengers, to our ancestors who lived before us to help us. Obviously, when you're standing there listening to that, you know that the elders are not just going to come up out of the graves and walk amongst us again. But I discovered that they did. Our ancestors sacrificed even in the afterlife because it went the way it should. They allowed white archaeologists to come and desecrate their graves, knowing that the things they made, their bones, would be sitting on the shelf waiting for us to discover them. It wasn't so that we could we didn't rediscover them in museums so that we could hurry up and take them home. We rediscovered them so that we could have a physical connection to the past. So that we could understand in this time now, when it's up to us, young people, to take over the responsibility and the roles that they once had. We didn't have it as good as them because we weren't surrounded by first language speakers. But they did their best. And again, it went the way it should. So they sacrificed. They allowed their graves to be desecrated. They allowed non-natives to take the things that they had because they knew that someday that we would need those things. And we're here now. Ironically, the museum had just as much a hand in me rediscovering language as much as the elders taught me. And this isn't any kind of sale of museums because I've worked there for 17 years. But all I'm saying here is that objects, the things they made, the things that our ancestors left behind, the things that they left in the ground to be rediscovered, ironically, those things helped to understand some of these things that the elders said. I'm sorry, but I can't translate that for you. I can help explain it, but I can't give you all the explanation. So that was very profound. And some of the words that we hear in some of these old things, it is hard. It's hard to understand what they mean and where they come from. And like I said, many times our elders sat there and said that I can't translate this for you, but I can just give you what I understand, what I know about it. So when Damon asked me to talk first, I guess he said, I need you to help set the scene and help set the minds of what's going to take place over the next couple days. So I thought, well, do I just sit here and talk about things that I've already talked about? Do I present on things that I've already presented? Because I'm always asked to talk about language, and I'm always asked to talk about my point of view, and I'm always asked to present facts. But I thought that here today, I would just present to you my true feelings and my passion for the reason why the yous are here today. So I really appreciate you being here, even if it's only for one day, even if it's only for a couple of hours. At least you've made the journey here. Ganödagë holds a special place in my heart because our ancestors at Tonawanda, a majority of them, that's where they went after Ganödagë. Some of them went west, some of them went east to a village that we call today as White Springs. So they left Ganödagë in 1687, but from 1650 to 1687, this was the biggest village of Senecas, west of the Genesee River. Still in the ancient homelands, they thrived They spoke their language. They lived by their laws. They were figuring out how to deal with the invader. They were living in a time of horror because when the invader came, he brought things that we never knew before. And all of our indigenous people all over North America, they lived in a time of horror when they were faced with this invader. So we did our best, they did their best to make sure that the things they had would survive on. So when you walk here, and as you're sitting here, just know that as you're just spending a few minutes, a few hours, 2 days, whatever you can contribute, just know that just beyond the hill, beyond the longhouse, there are Seneca ancestors resting, and they can hear us. So I'm sure that they're very proud of you as well. They're very proud to know that you're here and trying to make a difference. They know that you're surviving 300 years later, that you're still here, and that you're still doing just as well as can be. So just know that this place is very sacred. It's very sacred to the Seneca people. There's no such thing in this room as Tonawanda Senecas. There's no such thing in this room as Allegheny Senecas, as Ganödagë Senecas. There's no such thing as the Seneca Nation of Indians. We're all what they would have called at that time Ganödagë. Ganödagë Haga was what they called themselves, and there was no such thing at that time as any kind of political separation between their groups. They all lived under the roof that the Creator provided. They all walked on Mother Earth. They all spoke the same language with subtle differences here and there. But still at the time, there was no such thing as any kind of political separation. There was no such thing as the United States of America. There was no such thing as Canada. There was no such thing as you're from Grand River, I'm from this side. There was no such thing as, well, I'm Mohawk. I should only learn Mohawk. Because believe it or not, the Senecas, the language they spoke in the 1650s, was pretty much identical to the way that the Mohawk Nation spoke, the way that the Onondaga Nation spoke, and the way that the Cayuga Nation spoke. The language changed over the years, and part of the reason that the language changed over the years was, one, because of colonization, two, because we had to bring in other people, because we suffered diseases that we never heard before, we suffered wars that the kind of wars we never fought before. So to keep the things in place, to keep the families going, they adopted in, and they brought in other people, and they helped to what we now institute, or what they contributed, what we now call phonological changes. But nonetheless, these things survived, and nonetheless, we're still here. We're here at Ganödagë, and at that time they called it Ganödagë. It was also referred to as Ganödagë because that's the way the Huron Nation referred to it. The Hurons were a part of the Seneca Nation at the time, and just not too far away from here, there were 8 distinct Huron villages. They came to live among the Seneca. Their nation was destroyed by what we call Christianity. Their confederacy was destroyed because of what we call Christianity. The Jesuits tried their hardest to do the same to us, but we refused. Our ancestors in the Seneca territory pushed out the Jesuits, and by the 1670s, there wasn't one Jesuit left in Seneca territory. They asked them to leave as friends, but they refused, thinking that they would save our souls and send us to heaven. They told us that was the only way that we would get there. But our ancestors knew that can't be, because we have such beautiful language, we have such beautiful ways, we have such beautiful culture, and we can do without it. So just know that that's the strength that they had when Ganödagë was here. So just know that our ancestors who are resting just over the hill, just know that we're still doing the best that we can. That was the best that they could. So it's the same amount of energy. And it's the same love and affection that we often talk about when we do ceremonial speeches, because that's really what it boils down to. All our ceremonial speeches, the one thing that I learned is that it all comes down to just having the absolute love and affection for each other. In the language they say, Hoya'danä, So what that means is that he's dropping down progressively his utmost huge love and affection. And that's referring to the Creator. So I've heard all the elders say that in all ceremonial speeches. And I learned that that's really what it boils down to. Is having love and affection for each other, for who you are, for your kids, for your parents, your grandparents, and so on. In the language at Tonawanda, when they separate the ceremonial sides, we have Bear Clan, Wolf Clan, Turtle Clan, Beaver Clan. And at the time, when I was learning in our longhouse, they referred to those four clans as Ganödagë. So I asked my grandmother, how come he's not saying clans? And what does the word Ganödagë mean? And she said, because here we follow a different way. We follow the way of families. So also at Tonawanda we have birds, we have snipes, heron, hawk, and deer. Esther Sundown recorded one of the speeches for us where he burns tobacco, but he refers to that bird side, and he says, Wis Ganödagë. So I asked my grandma, why is he saying Wis? I said, there's only 4 clans on that side. And she says, because there was a time when we had 5 families on the one side. Used to be, but not anymore. So I said, well, why is he saying Ganödagë? And she says, because that's what that means. And she says it means that we used to have 5 families. So I didn't realize what that meant until I found and ironically, once again, the Jesuits wrote dictionaries. They were able to preserve and they were able to document the way that the Seneca ancestors spoke in the 1650s when they were here at Ganödagë. And in one of the entries, he gives the entry which is written gwad. In his translation, he says clay, but in parentheses, he writes family. So then I understood exactly what my grandmother meant when she said it means family. But then I had to ask even more because I said, well, why is it clay? What does clay have to do with anything? But then I realized one of the reasons why Haudenosaunee was formed in the first place, it wasn't because a peacemaker came. It wasn't because warfare came. It wasn't because we had lost our way for a little while. It was because there was a time when our ancient ancestors are what we call hunter-gatherers. They would follow the deer, they would follow the big animals, the elk that used to live here in the Northeast, They used to follow the northeast buffalo that roamed around the northeast. And they would gather as they were going in between the hunts. So they moved around quite a bit. Until a time came when they said, this moving around, it's not conducive to what we want to be. We want to grow bigger. So they had bigger dreams. So they said, the only way that we can do that is we can teach ourselves how to plant. So along the way, as they were moving around, they were given what we call anel, which is corn. Along the way, they discovered that there were beans. They were given beans, seeds. Then along the way, they were given squash. We call these the three sisters. So they came to this area. They went north. They tried to plant. The planting season wasn't as long. They went south. It was a little too warm. And then finally they came to a point where they said, this is the perfect planting season. We can hunt, we can still gather, but we can also plant corn, beans, and squash. So they did that. And because of that, the families were able to grow bigger. The families extended outward, just like the roots of the tree of peace. But in doing so, that's when they figured out that the animals cannot sustain people who live in one area for that long a time. That's when they began to come into conflict with each other, because they were all vying for one thing: to feed their families. The Cayuga Nation, just on the borders of the Seneca Nation, the Eries, the Neutrals, the Susquehannocks to the south, they all said, I have to provide for my family. But because they weren't hunter-gatherers anymore, they couldn't move. They had to stay in the same area. So then it became to all-out warfare. Or, as they say in the Great Law, the Tonawanda. So what happened was, the peacemaker came, and he says, you did the best you could with what you had. You did exactly with the way the Creator had made it to be. You took advantage of the food that He put here for you, and you made it bigger. And in doing so, your families got bigger. But I have to tweak it just a little bit. And He did so. So He gave us what they call the three basic principles of living in harmony: peace, power, and friendship. So what He did was He gave us a chance to live the way that we were already living, to discovering the things we had already to discover, but to do it all together. So one of the reasons we can call ourselves Haudenosaunee is because we were able to stop moving around and plant. The structure got bigger because the family got bigger. The fields got bigger because the families were getting bigger. The villages became palisaded. The longhouses got longer. And in doing so, the ceremonies also got bigger. And that set the stage for where you and I are now at. We were able to survive. Seneca villages in that time period lasted only up to about 20 years. And the reason why it only lasted up to about 20 years is because they had to gather firewood. They didn't have chainsaws, they didn't have axes, they didn't have wood splitters like you and I. So what they did was they gathered the wood from the floor of the forest. So at a time when they had to walk out 4 miles and then walk back another couple miles just to gather firewood, that's when they knew they had to change spots. But what they did was they turned to the women and they said, it's coming time to where we have to change the village site. And part of the reason they turned to the women isn't because necessarily women were tending the fields and taking care of the daily life in the home. It was because women, the Haudenosaunee women, had become masters of clay. They made clay vessels, they made clay pots. We couldn't live the way that we lived in a village, in a longhouse, and plant and cook those foods without clay pots. So they said to the women, they said, you're the masters of clay. The next village site, there has to be a source of clay nearby to sustain us for the next 15, 20 years. So the women would have to leave and go out. They would have to look into the ground, just like as it says, when they raise up a new clan mother or chief. They literally, physically had to look into the ground for clay. Sometimes it was ready to go, and sometimes it wasn't. It had dried hard, and they knew they had to put in the work to process the clay. So once they met with the women were able to do this. Once they figured out that the planting grounds, again, they had to look into the ground to make sure that the grounds were able to sustain the three sisters for the next 15 to 20 years. So in doing that, that gave women a lot of authority. It gave them a lot of power. It gave them a voice, all because of clay. So then I really understood why at Tonawanda we referred to our clans as Hoya'danä, the number of clays. So the women, because they were the masters of clay, they made the clay vessels, and they were even buried with them. They were filled with seeds, they were filled with tobacco, they were filled with the tools that were used to create the clay pots. They were given everything that they needed to be comfortable in the spiritual world. Again, another reason why we say Hoya'danä, the number of clays. So I'm very thankful for that. And it took me a long time to understand why we call families clay. Because it was the women who were the masters of it. They were the ones who gave birth, not only to the new village site where we would be comfortable, but they also gave birth literally to the next generation who would take over and become the next masters of the clay. They gave birth to children. So I see finally now another reason why we follow our mothers. We inherit their clan, where they come from, because they were the masters of clay. They made such beautiful clay pots. And at the Rochester Museum, we literally have probably about 300 to 400 of these clay pots. So to touch them and to see them and to know that the whole reason that we are still alive, the reason we say that our families are clay, is because of them. Standing there, we're looking at these large clay pots. I began to understand why at Tonawanda, when we announce a feast, whether it be for ceremony, for a giveaway, for a wake, or whenever we had to honor an ancestor, we say Skod and Zogen. So once again, I looked at my grandmother and I said, why is he saying Skod and Zogen? Because when I go to a feast, I take my Tupperware, I take my tin foil, I take all my different bowls. I says, I don't dip anything. So the only thing I could think of was, well, they scoop up the soup and they divvy it out. But it's still not describing what he's saying. Skod and Zogen. So my grandmother says, well, she says, you have to think about how our ancestors did. She goes, they didn't eat the way that we did. They all dipped from one pot. So again, the masters of clay, they set the stage for honoring ancestors. So the new village site, that's what had to be there, waiting. And it was the women who were the masters. They relied on the fresh clay when the village was born and it was new. The clay that they could dig out of the ground that was ready to go, that's what they used first. And then as the village got older, that's when they turned to the dry clay. But in doing all that work, they had to teach and bring the young women in with them because they couldn't do it themselves. They had to rely on each other. So they had to rely on the young people to help bring the clay back to the village. The older women would tell the younger women, this is the ratio you need from temper to clay, because this is the kind of clay we have to work with. So they weren't just learning how to make clay pots. They were learning how to come to a point in their lives when they would be responsible enough to make those large decisions. So our young women were ingrained with clay because they didn't just learn how to make a clay pot to drink out of, to cook out of. They were actually learning how to become a responsible adult and make decisions on behalf and for the benefit of the rest of the village. And that's how they did it. That's how our ancestors did it. From family to family, from mother to daughter, from mother to niece, from auntie to nieces and nephews. So now I understood why we say "gay who did that." When Corbett does our funeral speech, he says, "The young white go kanya." He says, "The young white that gay, and what the no get that's a. And what that means is he says, here in our home, in our community, we measure ourselves by 8 clays. 8, there's 8 of us. And I understood why. When the invader came, he brought forth a brass pot. And he said to us, this will make your life very easy. You won't have to live the way you lived anymore. You won't have to move around from village to village every 15 to 20 years. He says, I promise. But this is what I want in return. I want furs. I want the furs of all the animals in the forest. So our young people looked at our elders, because after a certain time, I'm sure the elders got very tired. The elders looked at our young people because they knew that there was a time when even the young people got tired. So they said, all right, we'll accept the brass pot. But what happened was when the brass pot came, it slowly eroded away at that family structure. Life had changed, it had evolved. So the clay pot, all the teachings, all the family interaction, that learning, women becoming masters of clay, learning how to make bigger decisions for the village and the families, the brass pot came and shut it all off. So the brass pot did to us no favors. But our ancestors, they did what they thought was best. They did the best they could with what they had. So again, here today, please understand, and I want you to consider yourselves as clay. beings of the earth. And for you women, I know that we all can't just go back to making clay pots to reinstitute those values. But when you talk to your children, just keep that in mind. Know that you're masters of the earth, that you are manipulators of the clay. You make clay pots to feed your children, and that takes a lot of work, easier than the brass pot. So I just want to say, Yahweh, I hope I did my best to motivate you. I hope I did my best to set the stage, not only for the 2 days, but for the rest of your career as students, teachers, mentors, ceremonial speakers, or even just knowing the language to bring it back into your home. And just know that also that I'll always be here to help you. If a time comes when you think that I may answer a question that you have, just know that I'll always do my best to help you. And even though I stepped away for just a little while, it doesn't mean I quit or I gave up. I wanted to discover other things and other places that would benefit us. I think I've done that. I'm not done, and I'm going to keep doing my best. What I have to offer, there's no charge. What I have to offer, I can't put a price on it. And what I have to offer, I just hope that it'll benefit you in some way. So just know, just like how we end all of our ceremonial speeches, that as the speaker who is straightening the mind, which we call Ganödagë, just know that this is the best that I could do. And if I dropped anything out, if I left out anything inadvertently, just know that you can fill that in yourself. And you can pick up maybe where I left off, or where I couldn't fill it in myself. So, I really hope that you put in the best over the next 2 days, even if it may not have been what you expected. Just know that everything happens for a reason. Our ancestors, like I mentioned, when they passed, they were knowing, looking into the ground. Our ancestors looked in the ground so much, for so long, and so hard. They knew that the time would come that their graves would have to be desecrated just as much. But they knew that in time, a positive would come out from that. Just because it may not have gone the way they expected, that doesn't mean you just throw it away or give up. So, I'll end it here, and I hope that I was able to offer you words and motivate you not only for the next 2 days, but for the rest of your life. So my next venture, the thing that I want to do next, I did the learning, I did teaching for a little while. So the next thing that I want to do next is I want to create resources for ceremonial speakers. I don't want to just hand you a CD with speeches on it. I don't want to just hand you a list of words that you can use in your ceremonial speeches. So my next venture, I'm going to do my best to write a comprehensive book, to break down and to put all this information in there. Because as a ceremonial speaker, you don't just stand up and just do something for the sake of doing it, just because it's tradition. You stand up and you do it for the utmost benefit of your people. So my next venture is I'm going to write a comprehensive book and break down all these words for you. I'm going to explain the history behind them from what I discovered. over the past 10 years that I've been studying in museums, in archives, the Jesuit dictionaries, and I'm going to put all those together for you. So just be patient, because it's going to take me a lot of work, but I'm very passionate about it, and I promise I will deliver. So I hope, just keep looking forward. I know that there's days when you know that it's hard. I know that there's days where you just know that you might have hit a wall. I know that there's going to be words you may not understand right away, and that's okay. So I'm going to leave it here. I'll be here for the rest of the day if you have any questions, if you want any more resources, and I'll be here even longer than that for you. I appreciate you, Yahweh, and Swadzalko, and just do your best with what you have, and that's all the Creator can ask of any of us. Yahweh, Ganödagë.